The year 1887 hung over Solitude, the way dust hangs in a sunbeam, quiet, stubborn, and everywhere at once. On a map, the town was barely a thumbprint. A clapboard main street, a church that doubled as a meeting hall, Abernathy's general store, and a saloon that pretended not to hear what it heard. But out here on the red flats of the American West, Solitude felt carved. Not built-hewn from grit and bad weather and the kind of luck that comes with CALLUSES. By noon, the light went white-hot and merciless, hammering the earth until it spidered with hairline cracks. Wind came and went like a rumor, carrying grit that found its way into a man's teeth, his boots, his coffee, and eventually his soul. Folks who lasted learned to move slow, speak less, and keep an eye on the horizon for storms that rose out of blue sky with no more warning than a breath. That was the stage, set when the weekly stagecoach rolled in with a hiss of brakes and a long-suffering sigh from the team. One passenger stepped down, a slight woman with a single scuffed satchel and eyes the color of late dusk. Clara May Thompson. She arrived with the soundless composure of someone who'd learned the world was kinder when it didn't notice you. Her dress was calico, faded to the quiet side of blue, and her hair was pinned with the practical exactness of a person who didn't have hands to spare for vanity. Clara rented the abandoned Miller cabin on the edge of town, a listing shack that had weathered more summers than it had repairs. Boards had silvered back to raw, soft with rot at the corners. The roof winked daylight in 3 places. A door sagged like an old shoulder. The one thing the place had going for it sat in the dirt out back, a long-forgotten stone-ringed well with a bucket rope still sound enough to test, and a dark, cool whisper that promised water from the hill above. A man watched her carry her life across the yard in 3 trips. Elias Thorne stood on the porch of his stone and timber house, arms folded, gaze level. He had the practical size of a rancher and the stillness of a loaded rifle. Lines cut down from the corners of his eyes like punctuation marks on a hard story. 10 years had taught him not to waste anything words, least of all. He'd seen her kind pass through, faces fresh to the west, eyes too soft for weather and men, trouble shadowing them like a stray dog. Only half the tailies that landed here were true, but half had been enough to get folks killed. Elias didn't trust tailies. He trusted patterns. And the pattern said this new widow would pull Solitude into something best kept outside its borders. The town got to work on its own version of her before she'd finished sweeping out the cabin. Mrs. Gable fanned herself into a breeze at Abernathy's and declared, between clucks of sympathy too sharp to be kind, that the widow's husband died over cards 2 territories away, leaving debts, whispers, and a wife who didn't know when to leave temptation alone. Men at the pickle barrel made the faces men make when they're deciding between curiosity and the trouble it brings. Women drew their children close the way birds tuck wings around fledglings. When hawks circle, Elias let the talk run 3 days. Then he saddled his bay, rode the fence line until he didn't need to rehearse what to say, and took the short slope down to the cabin. He didn't dismount. The stallion's shadow poured over the yard like ink while the widow knelt in the dirt, coaxing stubborn weeds from a square of earth that would one day be a garden if belief could make it so. She looked up under the brim of her hand. A smudge of soil striped her cheekbone like paint. Fear came and went in her eyes and left something steadier behind, the same way wind will flatten then smooth the prairie grasses. "Ma'am," he said. Not greeting, not threat, just a summons that expected being obeyed. Double quotes. "Mr. Thorne," she said, gathering herself to standing. "This is a hard place," he said, eyes lifting past her to the sagging roof, the grade boards, the sky that could turn murderous without changing color. It chews the weak and spits bones. Solitude keeps its peace by keeping to its ways. Don't bring trouble here. I've no intention of causing trouble, she said, voice quiet as a cool hand on a fevered brow. Trouble doesn't care about intentions, he said. It follows some folks the way a shadow does. Her mouth pressed, not into a smile, but into resolve. I'm stronger than I look, Mr. Thorne. She bent again to her weeds, which was as clean a dismissal as if she'd shut a door. Elias turned his horse with a hard pull he didn't need, rode back up the slope, and told himself the prickling under his skin was just the wind. Clara worked. She patched gaps in the walls with mud and straw, scrubbed the floors until the wood remembered how to show a shine, and set about learning solitude by helping where it hurt. When the blacksmith's wife burned her hand, Clara appeared with cool cloths and a steady voice. When old Jacob staggered in the road, she was there with water and a gentleness that didn't scold a man for being frail. She asked for nothing and still earned suspicion. That's a thing about the West. It looks like it has plenty of room, but folks' hearts can get tight as a laced boot. One evening, with the sky spilling purple into orange, a cry tore across Main Street. Little Lily Abernathy hopped and sobbed, clutching a calf with a ragged gash. Before her father could set down his crate, Clara was there, kneeling, voice low and even. She rinsed the wound with water from her canteen, tore a strip from her petticoat, and tied it with a small, exacting twist, one of those small, exacting things that only catch the attention of someone who has reason to remember. On his porch, cleaning a rifle he'd taken apart and reassembled more times than he could count, Elias went very still. It wasn't the kindness that caught him. It was the knot. Memory snagged like cloth on a thorn, just a moment's catch, a whisper, and then gone. A week later the wind changed. It came off the plains with a mournful sound, and the sky turned that particular, bruised shade that meant trouble would arrive wet. Elias tied down what could be tied, checked his fences, his gates, his animals. From his porch he could see across to the Miller place. At first it looked like any other fight between a roof and a gust. Then he saw the board bend back like a hinge, and Clara climb onto a crate with a hammer that belonged in steadier hands. Rain hid in fat coins, then in a flat sheet that erased distance. She fought the shingles like a soldier pinned behind bad cover. A plank ripped free and cartwheeled over the yard. She flinched, went back to her task, and Elias felt something in himself strain like old leather. Leave it. Let the West make its choices, same as it always has. He cupped his hands and shouted into the storm instead. The words came out of him raw and automatic, a command born from somewhere older than his stubbornness. Get inside, widow. She flinched and vanished through the door, with her hand over her hair. The crate toppled. The roof-held dash barely that morning smelled like wet sage and second chances. The world had been scrubbed back to its bones. Elias stood on his porch with coffee strong enough to float a nail and looked toward the ruined section of roof. The echo of his own voice, an order he had no business giving, sat ill with him. He wasn't a man who stepped into other people's storms. He wasn't a man who owed anybody anything. He went to the barn, loaded his wagon with pine boards, nails, and tools, and drove to the cabin without sending word ahead, because he had no intention of turning this into something as complicated as kindness. He didn't say hello. He set timber in the dirt with a thud that spelled out purpose, then climbed to the roof. The work settled his mind the way work does. Measure, rip, pry, replace. He refused water when Clara offered it. He refused conversation when she tried that too. The storm had left the air sharp and bright. The hammer in his hand took each nail with the same sure rhythm a heart should have. Below, she gathered scraps, stacked them for kindling, and matched his silence. The two of them moved like people who'd known one another a long time, which they hadn't, and which bothered him more than he could name. By midday the roof stood whole again, not pretty, but honest. He secured his tools and prepared to step down without looking at her. He would have managed it if she hadn't used his name. "Thank you, Elias," she said, his first name, soft as if she were testing the rightness of it in her mouth. He grunted, the kind of sound that tried to pretend it wasn't. Somehow, the most he'd said all day, climbed down and went back to his wagon. Distance felt safer than gratitude. Time out here is counted less by clocks than by chores. Clara's garden pushed green against red earth, beans and squash making tidy rows like children at lessons. She mended patching knees, darning elbows, smoothing out worn places with little invisible miracles, until the town had to work hard to keep disliking her. Some tried, Mrs. Gable especially, making herself indispensable, the banker's wife murmured in the store, sweet as a lemon that never learned how to be sugar. That's a widow's way. Elias didn't argue with gossip. He simply kept noticing what he noticed. He saw her hand a loaf to a prospector who'd lost more than gold that week. He watched her teach a boy how to pinch weeds from around beans without lifting the bean with them. He found her sometimes at the ridge, looking out past the last fence line toward the unbroken land, shoulders a little bowed by the weight of thoughts she didn't share with anyone. That look sorrow-worn, so long it had been. Ironed smooth stirred something that wasn't curiosity. It was recognition without a reason. He rode home angry with himself for caring about a face that didn't belong to him. Then trouble came in 5. Hard men rode in, faces unshaven, hands riding close to their pistols, eyes hungry in a way that had nothing to do with food. They sat in the saloon like wolves who'd found a sheepfold with weak boards. The air in Solitude went thin and tight. Doors shut earlier. Dogs stopped barking. Mothers counted children twice. Elias posted his own guard. He took the slope down to Clara's door and kept his voice low enough that the walls wouldn't repeat him. "There are men in town who aren't just passing through," he said. "Bolt your door. Don't open it for anyone you haven't already eaten supper with. You understand me?" She nodded, eyes wide for once. He left feeling marginally better, which lasted until that night when movement near her place set the hair on his forearms upright. He eased along the bluffs in shadow until he saw a small figure slip from the cabin with a bundle under her arm. He tasted rage before he'd earned it. Foolish woman. Or worse. He followed. Not toward the saloon, not toward any place a tryst would hide itself, but along the creek bank to a tumble-down lean-to where old Jacob lived alone with the ghosts of better days. Candlelight glowed for 20 minutes. When Clara stepped back into the night, Elias was already waiting, anger held on a leash that wouldn't hold. "What did I tell you?" He snapped, catching her arm before he knew he meant to. "Do you think men like that won't hurt you just to see if you bleed?" Jacob's arm was out, she said, breath quick but voice steady. "I said it. I brought him something for the paying. You think you can save everyone?" The fury in him wasn't all fear, and that was a problem he didn't have time to solve. "This land eats saints the same as sinners." She lifted her chin until their eyes were level. "I once saved a man worse than them," she said, quiet enough that the night had to lean in to hear. He lived. The wind moved through the grass like a hand. Somewhere, a late coyote called once, got no answer, and thought better of it. Elias let her arm go. He didn't apologize. He didn't know how. He turned away, the echo of that line walking beside him all the way home. The rain stayed gone. Blue sky turned from promise to punishment. Wells coughed and gave up mud. Grass gave in and showed ribs. Solitude did what Solitude always did, improvised. Buckets appeared on Clara's porch with no names attached to them. The miller, well-old, deep, stubborn, kept answering the rope with cool, dark music. She shared what she had the way a person breathes, without a ledger. Men like Jeb Sterling didn't care for that kind of math. "She's watering weeds and layabouts while our stock folds," he said to anyone who'd listen. His boys started riding slow along the fence line like men who were thinking about something they shouldn't be thinking about. Elias told himself he watched their tracks to protect his own boundary. He didn't believe himself and didn't try very hard. Nights, he sat his horse on the bluff and watched the glow of Clara's candle through that patched window. One night he saw her on her knees by the chair, shoulders shaking, praying so quietly even the wind had to guess at the words. It felt like trespassing to see it. He backed his horse away and gave the moment back to her, that piece of private grief he had no right to. The confrontation everyone in town pretended not to expect arrived on a day hot enough to bend thought. Clara had gone down to the dry creek bed to gather flat stones for her garden. Elias, a quarter-mile away, reined up over a patch of dead spring and heard a cry that stripped every thought from his head but one: run. He crested the rise in time to see a drifter press Clara into the rock, a knife flashing in his hand. Elias's roar hit the canyon wall hard enough to echo twice. By the time the drifter turned, Elias was already closing. The fight was short, ugly, exact. A block, a hammer of a fist, a twist pain tore across Elias's left shoulder, white and electric, as something old gave way under something sudden. He finished it with a crack of pistol barrel to skull, then stood in the quiet that follows violence and waited for his breath to find him again. "You're hurt," Clara said. Voice a rush of air that was more diagnosis than fear. "It's nothing," he lied. And the world tilted in reply. She got him home the way women have gotten men home for ever firm voice. Practical hands, no patience for pride. In the cool dim of the cabin she cleaned the reopened wound at his shoulder. And in the lamplight, the old scar showed its history. Puckered ridge, ghost white stitches, and at the end, by the collarbone, a small looped cross of thread a stitch. That was less about closing skin than leaving a mark for whoever needed to know. She froze. He followed her gaze down. Memory didn't snag this time. It yanked hard, a cellar dark as a mouth. Fever heat. A girl's hands, small but unshaking, pushing a needle through a man's skin with thread that wasn't meant for flesh. A voice like dusk telling him to stay. The world narrowed to her eyes, and the stitch she'd left him 10 years ago. "Is it you?" he asked, and the words weren't even words, just breath shaped around a question that had been living in him without a name. Clara's hand shook once. Instead of speaking, she laid her fingers very gently on that tiny cross of thread. A confession you could feel. Elias rocked to his feet like he'd been shoved, the room too small for what hit him. 10 years of blank space roared awake all at once. "Why didn't you say?" he demanded, grief and gratitude and fury all tangled and indistinguishable. "All this time why?" "I didn't know you lived," she said, tears slipping clean over the quiet lines of her face. "I looked for word until looking hurt. Then I ran out of ways to ask." He left the cabin because if he stayed, he would say the wrong thing, and if he said the wrong thing, he'd never get it back. Night air hit him like cold water. Stars stared down with the impartial curiosity of old judges. He walked home thinking about a girl's hands in a cellar, a widow's hands on a rifle, and a man who had been dead to himself for a decade and didn't know it, tomorrow, would bring answers he hadn't realized he needed. Tonight was for breathing. Tonight was for a truth too big to swallow all at once. Morning brought no peace to Elias Thorne. Sleep had been a losing argument, and the whiskey he'd poured to settle his thoughts had done nothing but make the silence louder. The house that had always felt steady now seemed full of ghosts, some his, some hers. and all whispering the same truth he'd tried to outrun for 10 years by sunrise. He'd already saddled his horse. He needed answers, proof, a name, a fact, a voice other than his own telling him that what he'd seen on his shoulder wasn't just the delirium of memory. He rode east 2 days later. He found Dr. Miller in Silver Creek, an old man, thin as paper and twice as brittle, sitting on a porch with a blanket over his knees and a pipe that had long gone cold. Elias dismounted, his shadow stretching across the porch boards. Miller. The doctor squinted into the light. "Lord above," he rasped. "Elias Thorne. Thought you'd gone to dust years ago." "Not yet," Elias said, voice flat. "You remember patching me up after the North Trail ambush?" Miller's watery eyes brightened. "That I do. Shoulder wound. Messy business. You were half gone when I found you. Somebody beat me to the sewing, though. Saved my job, truth be told." "Who?" Elias pressed. "Who stitched me?" The old man shrugged. "Never knew. Found you in the cellar of an abandoned homestead. Place had been squatted in. A man, woman, and a young girl, by what the neighbor said. But when I came back after taking you out, the place was empty. Vanished clean." Elias's throat tightened. "A girl." Miller nodded. "Couldn't have been more than 12, 13. Whoever she was, she did you a favor most grown men wouldn't dare attempt. Those stitches were crude, but strong. Had a strange little flourish at the end like a looped knot. Never seen one quite like it." Elias's breath hitched, quiet but sharp. That was all he needed. He tipped his hat, left a handful of coins on the rail, and rode off before gratitude could make him speak. The ride back to Solitude felt longer than the road east. He wasn't angry anymore, just hollow, like a man who'd spent years railing against the wrong ghosts. When the town finally came into view, its squat shapes shimmering in the noon heat, he saw movement in front of Abernathy's store. A crowd. Women mostly, their dresses fluttering like faded flags. And in the middle of them, a single figure standing straight and still. Clara. Mrs. Gable's voice, carried above the rest, sharp and shrill. "Curse, that's what she is. Ever since she arrived, drought and ruin. She brings death's shadow with her." Clara didn't answer. Her basket of mended clothes sat at her feet. She simply stood, back straight, eyes calm though her hands trembled. Where she clasped them, something in Elias broke. He swung down from his horse and strode straight through the gathering. Boots on dust, no hurry, no pause. The crowd parted on instinct, their whispers drawing in their throats. He stopped beside her, close enough to feel the tremor of her breath. He took her hand, every head turned. "You're wrong." "Mrs. Gable," he said, voice low but iron-bound. "This woman isn't a curse. She's the only reason I'm alive." Gasps rippled like wind through wheat. Clara's eyes widened, but he didn't look at her. His gaze stayed on the crowd. 10 years ago, after my brother was murdered, I was left for dead in the dust. I would have bled out if not for her. His voice thickened, each word pulled up from a place too deep for pride. A girl hid me, stitched my shoulder with nothing but burlap thread and willpower. She saved my life. He turned then, finally, to Clara. That girl was her. Silence. Absolute and heavy. Mrs. Gable's fan slipped from her fingers and landed in the dirt with a faint thud. Men shifted their weight, shame coloring their faces. Women glanced at Clara, then at one another, unsure what to do with the sudden ache of guilt blooming in their chests. Elias squeezed Clara's hand once, gently. Then he looked back to the crowd, his voice soft but final. "I owe her everything. You owe her your respect." He didn't wait for a reply. He led Clara away through the stunned street, her steps unsteady, tears bright in the corners of her eyes. The hand in his trembled once before it steadied. That night, he came to her cabin again, not no words. Just the sound of knuckles on wood and rain beginning to whisper against the eaves. She opened the door, the lamplight painting her face gold and pale. Asterisk, he didn't ask permission to step inside. The fire was low, its glow soft and warm against the simple furnishings. They sat across from each other in the small space where everything had started, and silent. Her uncertain. "I spent years wondering if you'd lived," she said finally, voice a fragile thing in the quiet. "I thought the raiders had taken everything. My father made us run. I never knew if you'd—" "I didn't know either," he interrupted gently. "Didn't remember enough to find you. Just a stitch and a pair of eyes." She smiled faintly, a ghost of something both sad and grateful. "And yet here we are." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You saved me once," he said. "Maybe twice. I don't think I ever learned how to thank anyone properly." "You just did," she murmured. They talked until the fire sank to embers. About Samuel, about the ranch, about the long years between that cellar and this moment. Their stories unspooled in quiet sentences, stitching themselves into something new, less wound, more healing. When silence finally fell, it wasn't awkward. It was the soft, steady kind that lives between people who no longer need to fill it. He looked at her then, really looked, and something inside him eased. "Stay for a while," he said, not a command this time, but a request. She did. That night marked the end of their distance. Not love yet, not fully, but the beginning of its outline. The fragile truce between two souls who'd finally recognized each other through the smoke. And the years by the next morning, the talk in solitude had shifted. Folks who had once crossed the street when Clara passed now nodded politely. Men offered to repair fences. Women brought bread with awkward smiles. No apologies were spoken, but the silence felt different, less cruel, more humbled. And as days folded into weeks, Clara and Elias fell into a rhythm the way seasons find their turn. He rode out early, mending fences, tending stock. She tended her garden, taught children their letters, and mended whatever the town broke. In the evenings, when the sun melted red into violet, Elias's horse would be seen making its way down from the hill, its rider always stopping at the cabin before heading home. It was gossip, then curiosity, and finally quiet acceptance. Some said Elias Thorne had softened. Others said Clara May had simply reminded him how to be human. Either way, the air between them grew thick with something neither could deny much longer. One night, a soft rain began, gentle, patient, the kind that cleans without destroying. They sat by her fire, close enough that the silence hummed with words unsaid. Elias told her about his brother, about fishing trips and laughter that still haunted him. She reached across the small table, laid her hand over his. He stopped talking. The touch was light, but it went through him like lightning through dry wood. He turned his hand, laced his fingers with hers. The rain softened, the candle flickered, and the world outside the cabin fell away. She looked up. He met her gaze. Whatever questions remained between them, the answers were wordless. When he kissed her, it wasn't the desperate clash of loneliness. It was the quiet exhale of two people finally home. A slow, trembling thing that spoke of grief, forgiveness, and the fragile promise of peace. Outside, the land breathed. Inside, for the first time in 10 years, so did Elias Thorne. The dawn after that night broke softer than usual, the kind of sunrise that seemed to hesitate before touching the earth, as if it knew something sacred had happened in the dark. Elias woke first. The fire had gone to embers, painting the cabin in a faint, golden haze. Clara still slept beside him, her hair spilling loose across the pillow, one hand resting lightly over his chest, where his heart beat slow and steady. For a man who had learned to live without warmth, the simple weight of her touch felt almost unbearable in its peace. He stared at the ceiling for a long while. The roof he had rebuilt himself. It didn't leak anymore. Neither did he. When Clara stirred, she blinked against the morning light, realizing where she was. A flush touched her cheeks, then faded when she saw the gentleness in his eyes. There was no shame in that silence, only understanding. "Good morning," she whispered. He smiled, a small, unguarded thing that startled even him. "Morning." They didn't speak of the night before. The West wasn't a place for confessions. Only continuations docked in the days that followed. Their lives wound together like two rivers finally meeting after carving separate canyons through the same hard land. Elias returned to his ranch each morning, but by evening, his horse could always be seen descending the hill toward Clara's cabin. He would fix things fences, hinges, the stubborn pump that never wanted to draw water unless it heard his curses. She would mend things, his shirts, the garden fence, sometimes even his temper. There was an ease between them now, unspoken but certain, like the rhythm of rain after a long drought. The town noticed Dot at first. They just watched. Then they began to whisper again, only this time the tone had changed. "That widow tamed him," someone said at the saloon. "Made Thorne a man again." Others weren't sure whether to call it luck or witchcraft. But no one dared insult her now, not after the way Elias had silenced Mrs. Gable in the street. One afternoon, the peace cracked. Jedediah Brody rode into Solitude with two of his broad-shouldered men with eyes like split flint. Brody was the kind of man who called himself a rancher, but made his living squeezing weaker men until they broke. He'd set his sights on the Miller property months ago, convinced the deep well on Clara's land was wasted on a widow and her patch of corn dot when he found her in her garden. He didn't bother with courtesy. "Afternoon." "Ma'am," Brody said, tipping his hat in mock politeness. "Seems a shame to see good water feeding weeds." Clara looked up from where she knelt, dirt on her hands, calm in her gaze. "It's enough for me." "Maybe, but a woman alone?" His tone soured, the smile dropping. "Bad things happen out here. Fires, snakes, accidents." Her heart thudded, but she didn't move. "The property's not for sale, Mr. Brody." He spat into the dirt beside her foot. "Everything's for sale, widow. Think on it." He turned his horse with a sneer and rode off, his men trailing like shadows. Dot by the time Elias heard, Clara had already gone quiet, her calm composure hiding the tremor beneath. When she told him, something in his face changed. The soft gray of his eyes hardened to cold steel. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "Stay inside," he said simply. Then he left. The town watched as Elias Thorne, tall, broad, and silent as judgment, walked straight down Main Street and stopped in front of the saloon just as Brody came swaggering out. The two men faced each other in the hot, still air. "Brody," Elias said. "Thorne." Brody smiled, smug. "You come to talk business?" "I am the business." Elias's tone could have frozen gun needle. "You'll leave her alone. You won't look her way. You won't ride her fence line. And if I see one of your men within 100 yards of her land, I'll take it as a threat." Brody's grin faltered. "You threatening me, Thorne?" "No," Elias said. "I'm promising you." Something in his voice made the onlookers shift uneasily. Brody's mouth tightened. After a tense pause, he gave a shallow nod and stepped aside. But everyone saw the fury that lingered in his eyes as Elias walked away. That night, for the first time in years, Clara felt truly safe. She watched Elias by the fire, his profile outlined in orange light, the set of his jaw softer now, almost content. For a brief, trembling moment, she allowed herself to dream. a home without fear, maybe even a family. Elias must have sensed her thought. He looked up and met her eyes. "We should get married," he said plainly, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "It's right. It'll protect you from men like Brody." The words should have filled her with joy, but instead her throat went dry. She looked down, fingers twisting in her lap. "I can't," she whispered. Elias frowned, confused. "Why not?" "I'm afraid," she said finally, tears pricking her eyes. "Afraid of what you'll think when you know the truth about my husband." He went still, crouched in front of her so they were eye to eye. "The man was a gambler who got himself shot. That's no shame to you." "It's more than that," she said, her voice breaking. "It's what he was. What he did." Her body shook. The memory clawed its way up from the place she'd buried it for years. Her name had been Clara Croft then. Her father, a kind man, beaten down by bad seasons and worse debts, had sold her hand to settle what he owed. Silas Croft was a traitor, a liar, and a brute with a smile that could charm and fists that could destroy. "He hurt me," she said quietly. "He owned me. And when he grew tired of that, he tried to sell me again to a man who'd pay for what no one should ever buy." Her eyes filled with tears that glimmered in the firelight. "He was drunk. There was a struggle. He reached for his knife. I pushed him. He fell." Her voice broke completely. "He didn't get up." She sat frozen, waiting for the disgust, for the recoil she knew must come. Instead, Elias reached for her hands. His grip was firm, grounding. "You survived," he said, his voice low and fierce. "You did what you had to do. Your past doesn't scare me, Clara. Losing you does." Her tears spilled freely then, but they were tears of release, not shame. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close until the trembling stopped. "Don't you ever leave?" he whispered into her hair dot the next morning. She didn't. She packed her few belongings books, a needle case, a single dress, and followed Elias up the hill. The big stone house that had once felt cold and empty took a breath as she crossed its threshold. Her rocking chair by the fire, the smell of bread in the oven, the sound of her humming as she swept the porch, these things softened its hard edges, filling the place with life for the first time in years. Solitude's gossip found a new story, but this one ended differently. The widow and the rancher, the savior and the man she saved. For a while, peace held, but in the West, peace is only the space between storms, Dot, and one man still couldn't stand that. Elias Thorne had won. Jedediah Brody was not used to being defied. When threats failed, he reached for fire. He found a drifter, a man with empty eyes and an empty stomach, and paid him to light the match. Dot. It happened on a moonless night. Clara woke first to the frantic whinny of horses and the glow flickering red through the window. "Elias!" she cried. He was already moving. Boots half on, rifle in hand. The old Miller stable, Clara's stable now, was ablaze. Flames climbing fast. "Stay inside," he barked, but she was already running after him. The fire roared like an animal. The mare screamed from within, the beams giving way. Clara shouted over the roar. Elias didn't hesitate. He soaked a blanket in the water trough, threw it over his head, and charged into the inferno. The seconds stretched into eternity. Then, through the smoke, he emerged, dragging the terrified mare by her halter. He'd made it 3 steps clear before the main beam collapsed behind him. A thunderous crash that threw sparks into the night sky. The horse was safe. He wasn't. A heavy burning timber caught him across the back and head. He went down without a sound. Elias! Clara screamed, sprinting through the smoke. She pulled at him, her hands blistering, dragging his limp body away from the flames. Blood poured from a gash at his temple. He was breathing, but barely. She pressed her palms to the wound, but the blood wouldn't stop. Panic clawed at her chest. She remembered an old story her grandmother had told her as a child about how a woman's sacrifice could stop the river of death. Without thinking, she ran for her scissors. She gathered her long hair thick, dark, heavy as memory, and cut it off in fistfuls. She packed the shorn locks into the wound, binding them with strips of linen torn from their bed. Her hands shook, but her heart didn't. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice raw. "Stay with me, Elias." For 3 days, she didn't sleep. She cooled his burns, spooned broth into his mouth, prayed until her voice was gone. The doctor from Silver Creek came and went, muttering of miracles. The bleeding had stopped. The fever held, but it hadn't taken him. On the 4th morning, Elias opened his eyes. He saw her first the short, uneven hair around her face, the exhaustion in her eyes, and the love in every line of her face. He reached weakly for her hand. "You didn't just save my life twice," he whispered, his voice barely more than breath. "You saved my soul." Clara bent her head against his hand, and for the first time since that terrible night 10 years ago, she wept from joy that the world outside their window was still scarred, still dangerous. But inside that house, inside their shared heartbeat, there was peace. And this time, Elias Thorne knew it wasn't going anywhere. The following week brought the kind of stillness that often follows catastrophe. Too quiet, too calm, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Elias healed slowly, his movements careful and measured, but his eyes had changed. There was something new there, a clarity, a purpose sharpened by fire and love. Clara tended to him with gentle hands and fierce determination, refusing to let him lift a finger. Yet even as she cooked, mended, and cleaned, Elias could see the worry flicker in her gaze whenever she thought he wasn't looking. She knew Brody wasn't finished. On the 5th morning, Elias pushed himself out of bed before she woke. His burns still ached. His shoulder throbbed. But he'd been still long enough when she found him at the table, maps spread out before him, his jaw was set. "You should rest," she said softly, a hand on his arm. "I will," he replied, "after I make sure this doesn't happen again." She studied him, then sighed, the kind of sigh that said she knew better than to argue. "What are you going to do?" "Fix what's broken," he said simply, "and make sure no man ever tries to take what's ours again." That afternoon, Elias rode to the county seat. The trip took a full day and half the night, but he returned with dust in his hair and documents in his saddlebags. "I've been to see a lawyer," he told. "Clara, your name's now on the deed to the miller. Place, legally, permanently." Her hand flew to her mouth. "Elias," he continued before she could speak, "and mine's now yours too. I've made sure no one can touch this land, this house, without your consent." He paused, his voice softening. "That makes us husband and wife in the eyes of the law. But I'd rather it be true in every way." For a moment, words deserted her. The enormity of what he'd done, the trust, the humility it took left her trembling. Then she smiled through tears. "Elias Thorne," she said, "you didn't have to give me anything." He reached across the table and brushed her cheek with his calloused thumb. "I didn't give you anything. You earned it the moment you walked into my life." News of the fire spread quickly through Solitude, carried by the stagecoach, the saloon, and the Sunday gossip of women who couldn't help but admire what they once condemned. When Elias's injuries and Clara's sacrifice became known, something shifted in the town's heart. The widow they had once shunned became the woman they now owed gratitude to. A few days later, a small delegation knocked on the Thorne Ranch door. Mr. Abernathy stood at their head, had clutched respectfully to his chest. "Ma'am," he said, "we've come to ask a favor." Clara, startled, led them into the parlor. Elias watched from his chair by the fire, his arm in a sling, his eyes curious. "It's the children," Abernathy continued. "They've got no schooling. No one to teach them their letters. We were hoping if you'd consider taking it on, teaching them here in town." Clara blinked in disbelief. The room seemed to tilt for a moment. Mr. Abernathy's wife stepped forward, her voice gentler. "You've got a gift for it, Mrs. Thorne. The children trust you." "We'd be honored." For a long time, Clara said nothing. She looked from face to faces that had once turned away, now softened by something close to reverence. She glanced at Elias, who gave a small nod, pride lighting his features. "I would be honored," she said at last. By spring, the Miller cabin had become Solitude's first schoolhouse. Clara scrubbed it clean, mended the cracks with her own hands, and filled the bare room with tables and slates donated by townsfolk. Each morning, a parade of dusty boots and laughter made its way up the path. Ranchers' sons and miners' daughters, children of drifters and merchants, all sat side by side, their voices spelling out the same words, their hands learning the same letters. Elias would sometimes ride down at midday, bringing her fresh water or a sack of apples. He'd stand quietly by the doorway, watching her teach, her face alight with patience and joy. The children adored her. They called her Miss Clara, even though she was now Mrs. Thorne. And every time Elias heard her laugh echo through the open window, something inhaled a little more. Their wedding came that summer, not grand, not loud, but full of the kind of quiet beauty that stays in the bones of memory. The whole town came. They gathered in front of the ranch house, where the wide porch served as altar and witness both. The judge from Silver Creek, a man with a kindly mustache and weathered hands, performed the ceremony. Clara wore her best blue dress, her shorn hair now grown into soft curls around her face. In her hands, she held a bouquet of wild prairie flowers, Lily Abernathy's gift. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, the crowd cheered, and Elias, for the first time in memory, smiled wide and unguarded. He leaned down and kissed her slow, certain, and deep. The moment seemed to still the wind. And for once, Solitude lived up to its name, not lonely, but peaceful. But peace, in the West, is fragile. While the townsfolk celebrated, another man sat alone in a saloon 2 counties over, his glass of whiskey trembling in his hand. Jedediah Brody had lost everything: land, money, reputation. The court had ruled against him, fined him heavily for arson, and barred him from doing business in the county, and all because of Elias Thorne. The law had humiliated him, and humiliation was something Brody couldn't abide. He wanted blood. In a dark corner of the saloon, he found a man who dealt in such matters, a bounty gunman known only as Cain, thin as wire, eyes flat as old glass, reputation mean enough to chill a room. Brody pushed a pouch of gold across the table. "I want it clean," he said. "Quick, at Red Creek Crossing. He rides there every month." Cain smiled a slow, cold stretch of lips that never reached his eyes. "Consider it done." Brody lifted his drink. "Make it look like a robbery gone wrong." "Doesn't matter how it looks," Cain said. "It'll be over fast." The next morning, Elias was packing his saddlebags. He kissed Clara softly before mounting his horse. "Only 2 days," he promised. "Checking the northern pastures. The grass is still good up there." But something about the way the light hit his face made her uneasy. "Be careful," she whispered. "That's where—" She didn't finish the sentence. He cupped her face in his hands. "That was a different time, Clara. A different man." His voice softened. "I'm not alone anymore." She smiled faintly, but her heart was already heavy. As she watched him ride away, a shadow passed over her soul, the same cold whisper that had haunted her once before. That afternoon, She went into town for supplies. As she left Abernathy's, she overheard two of Brody's men talking by the water trough. They were drunk, loud, careless. "Cain's waitin' at Red Creek," one slurred. "Paid good gold to make sure Thorne don't ride back." Clara's breath caught. For a moment, the world narrowed to the pounding of her heart. Red Creek Crossing. She knew that trail knew it too well, Dot. She didn't think. She didn't plan. She just ran Dot by the time the men realized she'd overheard. She was already gone sprinting for the stable, saddling her mare with trembling hands. The last words she heard before the wind took her were, "She'll never make it in time." But they didn't know Clara Thorne. She would ride through hell itself, if it meant saving the man she loved. Night fell like a curtain as she galloped north, the cold air slicing her cheeks, tears blurring her vision. The moon hung low, pale and watchful, lighting her path over the open plains. "Please," she whispered into the wind, clutching the reins tighter. "Please let me be in time." Each hoofbeat was a heartbeat, each gust of wind a prayer. Somewhere far ahead, in the half-light of dawn, Cain waited, rifle loaded, patience infinite, and Elias Thorne was riding straight toward him. The horizon bled pink into gold when Elias reached Red Creek Crossing. The land there was quiet, deceptively so, the sort of quiet that made a man listen harder, sensing the wrongness hidden beneath the beauty. The creek itself had long since dried to a thin ribbon of silver, threading through the cracked bed like a vein. The air smelled of dust and sage, the way it always did before trouble. Elias dismounted, crouched by the water, and let his hand hover just above the surface. Thought the reflection that met him was a stranger, a man with gray at his temples, a scar like lightning across his shoulder, and eyes that had seen too much to ever be young again. He sighed. "You're getting old, Thorne." Behind him, a bird startled one sharp cry, and then silence. He froze. A whisper of leather. A faint shift of air, the kind of sound only killers make. Elias straightened, his hand drifting toward his holster, voice steady. "You can come out now. No use pretending." From behind a stand of cottonwoods, a man stepped forward. Lean, angular, long coat flapping around his knees. His face was narrow, his smile cruel. "Cain," Elias said quietly. He'd never met the man before, but he knew the type, the way a wolf knows the scent of blood. "You must be Thorne." Cain replied, voice like dust sliding over steel. "Can't say I'm surprised. You've got that look about you, man, who thinks he's already seen the worst the world can do." Elias's fingers brushed the butt of his revolver. "I don't think." "I know." Cain grinned, showing teeth. "Good. Then you won't take it personal." His hand dropped too fast for most eyes, but Elias had spent his whole life in the kind of country that taught you to move first or not at all. The first shot cracked through the still morning air, echoing off the canyon walls. Elias's hat flew from his head. Cain's bullet missed by inches. Elias fired once in reply. The gunman rolled, hit dirt, came up behind a boulder, reloading with mechanical precision. They circled each other across the creek bed, trading fire and silence. The shots were fewer now, careful each one, measured, calculated. Cain's voice drifted through the smoke. "Brody was right about you. Stubborn, dangerous, should have died in that fire." Elias ducked behind a dead tree trunk. "Brody sent you?" Cain's laugh was humorless. "He paid well. I don't ask why a man wants another dead. I just make it happen." "You'll regret this," Elias said. "Doubt it." Another shot whined past his ear, close enough to sting. Elias's revolver clicked empty. He ducked, pulled the spare cartridge belt from his saddle, and slammed fresh rounds into the cylinder. His shoulder screamed in protest, the old wound reopening beneath the strain. He gritted his teeth. Not today. Miles away, Clara rode like a woman possessed. Her mare sides gleamed with sweat, hooves throwing sparks from the rocks. The wind tore at her hair, the hem of her skirt, her breath. Every muscle in her body ached, but she didn't slow. The sun was higher now, and she could smell the smoke of gunpowder on the air before she even saw them. Elias! She gasped, urging the horse onward. When she crested the last rise, her heart nearly stopped. Below, the two men moved like shadows, one ducking behind the boulder, the other rolling into cover near the creek. Each muzzle flash lit the dust in violent bursts of light. "God help me," she whispered, and spurred the mare down the slope. Elias was running out of cover. The boulder behind him cracked with another bullet. He dove forward, landing hard in the sand, and came up firing. His bullet grazed Kane's arm, spinning the gunman sideways. Kane snarled, "You got fight in you, old man. Enough to finish this." But before either could move again, the thunder of hooves shattered the air. Both men turned as Clara burst into the clearing, hair flying, eyes wide with terror. "Elias!" She screamed. Kane reacted first. His rifle swung toward her. Time broke apart. Elias didn't think he moved. He lunged from cover, throwing himself between the gunman and his wife. The shot went off, the sound deafening, and pain exploded through his chest like fire. He staggered, hit the ground hard. "No!" Clara's cry split the canyon. She slid from her horse before it stopped moving, falling to her knees beside him. Blood soaked his shirt, dark and spreading fast. Kane reloaded calmly, stepping forward. "Didn't plan to shoot her," he said, voice almost regretful. "But business is business." He raised his gun. Clara's hand found Elias's revolver where he had fallen beside him. She lifted it with both trembling hands, eyes blazing. "Business," she whispered, "is done." Her shot hit Kane square in the chest. The force knocked him backward. He looked down at the spreading red on his coat, a strange disbelief crossing his face, then fell without a sound. The echo of the gunfire rolled away across the plains, swallowed by distance. For a moment, there was nothing, no wind, no sound, just the shallow, ragged breathing of a man fighting not to die. Clara pressed her hands to Elias's wound. "Hold on," she whispered. "Please hold on." He coughed, eyes unfocused, then found her face. "You shouldn't have come." She laughed through her tears. "And you should have stayed home." His hand found hers, weak but warm. "You're a stubborn woman, and you're impossible," she said, her voice shaking. He smiled faintly, blood on his lips. "That's why we fit." The hours blurred. Clara half carried, half dragged him onto the horse, riding slow but relentless toward solitude. The road shimmered in the heat, each mile a test of will. By the time she reached town, she could barely speak. "Help, please." People poured from the buildings, shouting for the doctor. They carried Elias into Abernathy's store cooler inside. The counters cleared for space. Dr. Miller, summoned again from Silver Creek, worked in grim silence. The bullet had gone deep but missed the heart by inches. "He's strong," Miller muttered. "If he makes it through the night, he'll live." Clara sat beside the bed, fingers entwined with Elias's. Her face was streaked with blood and dust, her eyes hollow but fierce. Mrs. Abernathy brought her water, whispering, "You're the bravest soul I've ever seen." But Clara didn't feel brave. She felt broken. All she could do was hold him and pray to a God who had already taken too much from her life. Night fell. The lamp burned low. Outside, the cicadas hummed their endless song. Elias stirred, his breathing shallow. "Clara," he rasped. She leaned close, brushing the hair from his brow. "I'm here." He blinked slowly, his gaze clearing for just a moment. "If I don't make it," "Don't you dare," she whispered fiercely. "Don't you leave me. Bury me by the creek," he said, voice fading. "Where we first met." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "You're not dying, Elias. Not now. Not ever." He managed a faint, weary smile, bossy as ever. Then his eyes fluttered shut, and for a terrifying moment she thought he was gone. "Elias!" she cried, but then just barely she felt it, the faintest beat beneath her palm. He was still fighting. She bowed her head and sobbed, whispering prayers through her tears, until the first light of dawn slid through the windows. The storm had passed, but the fight for his life had only begun. And Clara Thorne, widow, teacher, survivor, wasn't about to let the West take the man she loved. Not this time. The dawn that broke over Solitude was thin and pale, the kind of fragile light that dared not disturb the quiet grief of the town. The storm of gunfire and fear had passed, but its echo lingered in the hushed voices of the people, in the creak of wagon wheels rolling down the dirt road, and in the soft sobs that drifted from the open window of the Abernathy store. Where Elias Thorne lay clinging to life, Clara hadn't slept. Her fingers were locked around his hand, her thumb tracing slow, desperate circles against his skin, as if she could coax warmth and strength back into him. The air was heavy with the scent of whiskey, blood, and the bitter tang of carbolic. Dr. Miller worked quietly, methodically, his lined face carved with concentration. "Bullet missed the heart," he murmured, dabbing away the blood with steady hands. "He's a stubborn man, this one. That's in his favor." Clara nodded, but her voice failed her. She couldn't bear to speak, not when every sound felt like it might shatter the fragile thread holding Elias to this world. When the doctor finally stepped back, his shoulders slumped. "He'll need time," he said, soft but firm. "Keep him still. Keep him warm. And pray." Then he left, his boots thudding against the wooden floor, leaving Clara alone with the man who had once sworn never to need anyone. She wiped the sweat from Elias's brow with a damp cloth. His face was ashen, his lips cracked and pale, but when she leaned close, she could still feel the faint rhythm of his breathing. "Don't you dare leave me," she whispered. "Not after everything." For hours she sat there in silence, the town outside moving on fragile feet. People came and went, bringing food, water, blankets, simple offerings of gratitude for the woman who had risked everything to save the rancher who'd once kept to himself. Mrs. Abernathy brought a small loaf of bread, still warm. Old Jacob, his arm still stiff from the night she'd mended him, left a canteen of fresh well water on the counter and slipped away without a word. Even Mrs. Gable, who had once called her a curse, lingered near the doorway before muttering, "He's a good man," and leaving a small wooden cross on the bedside table. Clara didn't move. Her world had shrunk to the sound of Elias's breathing, the shallow rise and fall of his chest. Each one a battle she prayed he would win. Night came again. The oil lamp flickered low, casting long shadows that crawled across the floorboards. The wind moaned outside, carrying the lonely howl of a coyote across the plains. Elias stirred, just barely, his lips parting. "Clara." She leaned forward, her heart catching. "I'm here. You're safe." His voice was faint, the words scraping against the dry air. "You shouldn't have come to the crossing." She laughed softly, a sound halfway between a sob and relief. "And leave you to get yourself killed? Not a chance." He tried to smile but grimaced instead, pain flickering across his face. "You're a stubborn woman. You've told me that before," she whispered. "And you keep proving I'm right to be." He exhaled shakily, his eyes fluttering closed again. "You saved me, again." Clara's throat tightened. "And I'll do it 100 more times if I have to." His breathing steadied, deeper now, the faint tremor in his fingers easing. For the first time in 2 days, Clara dared to hope that by the third morning the bleeding had stopped. The fever came and went like the tide, but the worst had passed. When Elias finally opened his eyes to the golden light of mid-morning, Clara was dozing in a chair beside him, her head resting on her folded arms. Her hair, cropped short after the fire, framed her face in uneven waves, and dark circles hollowed her eyes. Even in exhaustion, she was beautiful. He turned his head slightly, wincing. Clara. Her eyes shot open. Elias? She was on her feet in an instant, gripping his hand. You're awake. Seems that way, he said weakly, his voice rough as gravel. Though I half thought I'd gone to heaven. She smiled through tears that blurred her vision. You're not there yet. You're still stuck here with me. He squeezed her fingers, faint but sure. Could be worse fates. She let out a small, trembling laugh, brushing her sleeve across her face. Don't talk like that. He studied her quietly for a long moment. You look tired. So do you, she said softly. But you're alive. That's enough. He nodded slowly. I suppose it is. His gaze drifted to the window. What happened, Cain? Her face darkened. Gone. I shot him. He blinked, as if the words didn't quite settle. You? Yes. Her voice was steady now, iron beneath the sorrow. He aimed at me first. I just finished what he started. Elias let out a long breath, his chest rising and falling under the bandages. Good, he said finally. He won't hurt anyone else. For the first time since the shooting, he slept without fever. Over the following weeks, the rhythm of life returned in fragile, hesitant steps. Elias grew stronger, though his movements were slow and stiff. The scar on his chest would stay with him, another reminder of a life that refused to let go. Clara never left his side. She cooked for him, changed his dressings. Read to him by the light of the fire in a soft, melodic voice that soothed his pain better than any tonic sometimes. In the still hours of night, he would wake to find her watching him, her hand resting lightly over his heart, as though she feared it might stop if she didn't guard it herself. On one of those quiet nights, as the fire crackled low, Elias spoke. Clara, when I was shot, I thought about Samuel, about all the things I never said to him. I thought about the men who betrayed us. And then I saw your face. Her eyes shimmered. You thought of me? He nodded faintly. I thought of the cellar, of the girl who saved my life before I even knew her name. She reached out, brushing a hand against his cheek. And I thought of the man I dragged out of the fire. His smile was small, weary, but real. Seems we've been saving each other a long time. By the end of the month, Elias could walk again. The town turned out to greet him when he first stepped outside, leaning heavily on Clara's arm. Children waved. Men tipped their hats. Even Mrs. Gable brought a jar of preserves with a stiff, embarrassed nod. Clara laughed softly. Looks like the West finally found a heart. Elias grinned, wincing at the pull in his chest. Or maybe it just took a stubborn schoolteacher to remind it. It had one. The sun was warm on their faces, the dust glinting like gold in the air. It felt, for the first time in years, like the world had forgiven them both, but the shadow of Jedediah Brody still lingered like a poison in the wind. He had vanished after the ambush-ridden South, some said to the borderlands. Others swore he was hiding in the Badlands, gathering men with old grudges and darker motives. Elias didn't speak of it, but Clara saw the way his jaw tightened when riders passed near their property, the way his hand hovered near his gun belt when a stranger came to town. They both knew the peace wouldn't last forever. Still, they cherished it while they could dot in the evenings. They sat together on the porch of the ranch house, watching the sky bleed into fire and rose. Elias's arm would rest around her shoulders, and she'd lean into him, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against her cheek, a sound that had once nearly stopped forever. One night, she whispered, "Do you ever wish things had been different? That the world had been kinder to us?" Elias thought for a long moment. "If it had been kinder, I might never have found you." She smiled faintly. "You always know the right thing to say." He chuckled, low and rough. "That's because I learned from the best. But peace is a fragile thing in the West. It can shatter in an instant. Like glass under a boot-heel dot and in the dark corners of the frontier. A wounded man with nothing left to lose was preparing to make sure that it did. Jedediah Brody had not fled south. He had not hidden in the hills. He had been waiting, watching, plotting Dot, and as the days grew warmer and the rains came less often, he saddled his horse beneath a blood-red dawn and whispered, "Thorn's time is coming." The wind carried his words east, toward solitude, the same wind that would soon bring the final reckoning. The summer heat had settled heavy over solitude like a fever that would not break. The days stretched long and bright, the sun baking the red earth into hard clay. The wind carried the smell of dry sage and smoke from distant brush fires. It was the kind of weather that made tempers short and danger close. Elias Thorne felt it in his bones. The peace that had settled over his land since the shooting now felt too still, too perfect like the hush before thunder. He rose before dawn each day, his shoulders still stiff, but strong enough for a rifle again. Clara watched him from the porch as he saddled his horse, her fingers tight around a cup of coffee gone cold. Every morning, "You look like you're chasing ghosts," she said softly. He turned, a faint smile playing at his lips. "Maybe I am. Or maybe you're just afraid they'll come chasing you." He didn't answer. He only touched the brim of his hat and rode out into the blazing horizon. Out on the range, the land spread out in endless waves of red and gold. The cattle moved slow under the sun, their shadows thin on the baked ground. But Elias's eyes weren't on them. They were on the ridgeline, scanning for movement, for the glint of a rifle barrel, for the flash of vengeance. He'd been a soldier once. He knew the patterns of men who hunted other men, and the tracks he'd found 2 days earlier, fresh hoofprints leading through the dry creek bed, were no coyote's wandering trail. Someone had been watching the ranch Dot that evening. When he came home, Clara was waiting with the same worry etched deep in her face. "You found something, didn't you?" He hung his hat by the door and poured himself a drink before answering. "Tracks near the North Ridge. 3 horses, maybe 4, keeping to the rocks. Could be ranch hands cutting through, or could be trouble." She stepped closer, her voice low. "You think it's Brody?" Elias met her gaze. "I know it is." The words settled between them like a shadow. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She sat by the open window, the faint night breeze stirring the lace curtains. Below, the land stretched out dark and quiet. The only sound the creak of the old windmill and the low murmur of cattle in the distance. Elias had fallen asleep in the chair beside the bed, boots still on, rifle leaning against the wall within arm's reach. His face, even in rest, carried the hard lines of vigilance. She rose and crossed to him, brushing a hand against his jaw. "You've fought enough battles," she whispered. "When does it end?" He stirred, half awake. "When men like Brody stop breathin'." There was no bravado in his voice, only grim certainty. She kissed his forehead and returned to bed, though her eyes stayed open until the first gray light of dawn crept through the window. 2 days later, the storm came not of rain, but of dust, and men got it started with the riders. 3 of them, cutting across the eastern pasture at full gallop, driving the cattle into chaos. Elias saw the movement from the ridge and spurred his horse hard. Shouting to the ranch hands to spread out, Clara heard the noise from the house, the distant thunder of hooves, the crack of gunfire, and her blood ran cold. She ran to the barn, grabbed the rifle Elias had taught her to shoot, and loaded it with trembling hands. By the time she reached the porch, the sky was thick with dust. She could see shapes moving on the far slope, men on horseback, rifles flashing in the sunlight. Brody, she breathed. Her heart hammered as she took position beside the porch post. Aiming down the slope, Elias rode into view moments later, firing as he came, his hat gone, his face streaked with sweat and dirt. "Get inside," he roared, his voice cutting through the chaos. But she didn't move. "Not again," she whispered, her hands steady on the rifle. One of Brody's men broke from the group, aiming for the house. Clara exhaled slowly, sighted down the barrel, and squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out sharp and true. The man toppled from his saddle before he even hit the fence line. Elias saw it and shouted, something she couldn't hear, but there was pride in his eyes. The skirmish spread across the field like wildfire. Elias and his men held the line, their bullets cutting through the swirling dust. For every outlaw that fell, another appeared from the hills, screaming Brody's name. And then Brody himself emerged. He rode a black stallion, his long coat billowing behind him like a storm cloud. His face was lean and burned by the sun, but his eyes, those cold, snake-pale eyes, were fixed on Elias with murderous intent. "Thorn!" he bellowed, his voice echoing across the valley. "You think you can take what's mine and live?" Elias reined in his horse, rifle steady in his hands. "I don't take from cowards." Brody grinned, showing yellowed teeth. "Then die honest, rancher." He fired. The shot went wide, grazing Elias's arm. Elias returned fire instantly. The bullet tore through Brody's shoulder, spinning him in the saddle. His horse reared, screaming. Still, Brody clung on, blood soaking through his coat. "You should have stayed dead." Brody shouted, fumbling for another shot. Before he could fire, Clara's voice rang out high and fierce. "Leave him be." Brody's head snapped toward the sound. Clara stood on the porch, rifle raised, her face pale, but her eyes bright as fire. Elias's heart froze. "Clara, no." But it was too late. Brody swung his pistol toward her. Elias moved before he thought. He kicked his horse forward, the world narrowing to the pull of the trigger. He fired once clean, certain. Brody jerked back in the saddle, eyes wide with shock. For a long, suspended heartbeat, the two men stared at each other, the end of a long, bitter war between them written in the silence. Then Brody fell. He hit the ground hard, a puff of red dust rising around him. His horse bolted. The gunfire stopped. The riders scattered, their courage gone with their leader. The air hung heavy and still. Elias dismounted slowly, breathing hard. His shirt was torn, his arm bleeding, but he was alive. Clara ran to meet him, her rifle forgotten in the dirt. "Elias!" He caught her as she reached him, pulling her close, his body trembling with exhaustion and relief. For a moment, neither of them spoke. When he finally found his voice, it was low and raw. "You should have listened when I told you to get inside." She laughed through tears. "You should know by now, I never do." He pressed his forehead to hers, their breath mingling in the heat. "You saved me again." "Seems to be a habit of mine," she said, smiling through the dirt and sweat. He looked at her, really looked at the woman who had crossed deserts, storms, and years of sorrow for him, and something in his chest eased at last. "It's over," he whispered. She nodded, her eyes full of weary peace. "Then let's finally live." The days that followed were quiet. Brody's body was buried in a shallow grave at the edge of the canyon, where the wind could take what was left of him. The men who had followed him rode out of solitude before sunrise. leaving behind a silence that felt almost sacred. The town rebuilt what little damage had been done. And on the Thorn Ranch, life began to take root again. Elias's wound healed slowly, leaving another scar to join the many already carved into him by the West. Clara's hands stayed busy cooking, teaching, mending, but her laughter, once rare and cautious, now came easily. Sometimes she'd catch him watching her from across the yard, and she'd smile knowingly. "What are you staring at, Mr. Thorne?" He'd grin, tipping his hat. "The reason I'm still breathing." One evening, long after sunset, they stood together on the porch. The stars stretched out above them, endless and bright. The air was cool, the first sign that autumn was creeping in. Elias slipped an arm around her waist, pulling her close. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked quietly. She tilted her head against his shoulder. "Once I thought the only way to survive was to run. But now?" She looked out across their land. "Now I think we've done enough running. This is home." He nodded slowly. Home. The word felt strange on his tongue, but right. Like a prayer finally answered. They stood that way for a long while, the night settling around them like a warm blanket. The ghosts of their pasts finally laid to rest. Neither of them noticed the faint glow of lanterns, flickering in the distance riders, approaching from the north, bearing news that would once again test the limits of their peace. 4 in the west. Even love was a frontier, and peace, like water, was something you had to fight to keep. The lantern light on the horizon came like a mirage, faint, flickering, almost beautiful in the dark. But to Elias Thorne, beauty in the night rarely meant safety. He rose from the porch chair, his instincts sharpened by years of surviving what others did not. The boards creaked softly under his boots as he stepped forward, squinting into the distance. "Riders," he murmured. Clara joined him at the rail, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The moonlight traced silver across her short hair. "Maybe travelers?" "Not likely," he said, already reaching for his rifle. "Nobody rides this trail after sunset, unless they've got business or trouble." The riders came fast, their silhouettes growing larger, until Elias could make out 3 men, their horses lathered with sweat. The lead rider held something white, a handkerchief tied to a stick. "Stay behind me," he said quietly. "I'm not hiding," she replied, her voice firm. He glanced back, half a smile tugging at his mouth. "Didn't think you would." When the riders reached the fence line, Elias recognized the man at the front. Sheriff Crane, hat low, coat dusted with the long road. "Evenin', Thorne," Crane called, pulling up his horse. "Sorry to come callin' so late. You best hear this in person." Elias lowered the rifle slightly, but didn't relax. "Go on." The sheriff took off his hat, rubbing a hand through his hair. "There's talk from down south. Brody's cousin, Silas Brody, got wind of what happened here. Says you murdered his kin and stole his land. He's raising a posse 30 men, maybe more." Clara's stomach dropped. "More violence?" she whispered. Crane nodded grimly. "They're heading this way. Be here in 2, maybe 3 days." Elias's expression didn't change, but something in his shoulders tightened, a familiar weight settling across him. "Then we'll be ready." "Thorne," the sheriff said, lowering his voice, "I ain't saying you don't have a right to defend what's yours. But this won't be a fair fight. These men ain't comin' for justice. They're comin' for blood." Elias looked past him, toward the horizon where the lantern light had disappeared. "They'll get what they came for." Crane sighed. "I figured you'd say that." He tipped his hat toward Clara. "Ma'am." Then he rode off, his men following into the dark. That night, the ranch didn't sleep. Elias gathered every ranch hand, every able-bodied man in solitude willing to stand for more than their own doorstep. They built barricades from wagon boards and barrels, stacked sandbags along the porch rail, and dug trenches behind the barn. Clara worked beside them, sleeves rolled up, dirt smudged across her face. She moved with the calm precision of someone who had already faced death, chosen to fight anyway. When one of the younger men tried to stop her from carrying a crate of ammunition, she fixed him with a look sharp enough to cut through steel. "I've buried enough people in this town," she said quietly. "I don't intend to bury another." By dawn, the ranch looked less like a home and more like a fortress. The following day stretched slow and silent. The sun hung low and mean in the sky. Even the wind refused to move. Clara stood at the window, staring at the hills. "It feels like waiting for a storm," she said softly. Elias came up behind her, resting a hand on her shoulder. "That's exactly what it is." She turned to face him, her eyes filled with fear and resolve in equal measure. "Promise me something. Name it. If you see them coming for me, you don't stay. You ride." He met her gaze, steady and unflinching. "No, Elias, no," he repeated, his voice low but final. "I didn't survive a bullet, or a fire, or a life without you just to ride away and watch it all burn again. We finish this together." Tears welled in her eyes. "You make it sound like the end." He cupped her face, his thumb brushing away a tear. "It's not the end, Clara. It's the beginning we earned." The attack came at sundown. 30 riders thundered across the plain, the sun behind them like a curtain of fire. The earth shook beneath the weight of their charge. Dust rising in a storm around them. Elias stood on the porch, rifle in hand, his men in position. "Wait for it," he muttered. The riders came closer, shouting, waving guns, their faces twisted in hate. Now. The first volley cracked through the air, echoing off the canyon walls. The attackers scattered, horses screaming, men shouting in confusion. Bullets tore through the fence line. The air filled with smoke and dust. Clara was inside, kneeling by the window, loading rifles as fast as she could. Her hands shook, but her aim did not. Outside, Elias moved like a man born to battle. Calm, efficient, unyielding. Every shot he fired found its mark. But there were too many of them. When one of the riders broke through the line and charged the porch, Clara didn't hesitate. She stepped out, rifle braced against her shoulder, and fired. The man fell from his horse, his weapon skittering across the dirt. Inside, Elias shouted, grabbing her arm, "Not without you." He swore under his breath and pushed her through the doorway. Just as another bullet tore through the porch rail, they hit the floor together, the air thick with gunpowder. "You all right?" he asked, breathless. "I'm fine," she said, reloading with trembling hands. "You?" He grinned through the smoke. Still standing. The battle raged for what felt like hours, the sound of gunfire blending with the cries of men and the thunder of hooves. The smell of dust and blood filled the air. But then, as suddenly as it had begun, the noise began to fade. Elias stepped out into the yard, rifle still ready, eyes scanning the field. Bodies lay strewn among the sagebrush. The survivors were retreating, their courage finally broken, and at their head rode Silas Brody, his arm in a sling, face twisted with fury. He pulled up hard, his horse rearing. "You think this is over, Thorne?" he shouted. "You killed my kin." Elias leveled his rifle. "Your kin brought death to my door. You just came to finish his mistakes?" Silas sneered. "You'll never be free of us." The Brody name doesn't forgive. Elias's voice was steady, cold. "Neither does mine." He fired once. The shot echoed like judgment. Silas toppled from his saddle, landing face first in the red dust. The remaining riders fled without looking back. Silence fell over the ranch. The world seemed to hold its breath. Clara emerged slowly from the doorway, her face pale, her eyes wide. Is it? Is it done? Elias lowered his rifle. It's done. She crossed the yard to him, stepping over the scattered debris until she was close enough to touch him. He looked at her, at the soot on her cheeks, the determination still burning in her gaze, and felt something inside him loosen. The last knot of anger, of grief, finally undone. She threw her arms around him, burying her face against his chest. "We made it," she whispered. He held her tight, his voice low against her hair. "We always do." Weeks later, the land began to heal. The broken fence was rebuilt, the porch mended, the air once again filled with the sounds of life instead of war. Clara's school reopened, her laughter filling the cabin that had once echoed with silence. Children from all corners of Solitude came to learn beneath her gentle guidance. And Elias, the man once defined by his solitude, was no longer a ghost of the past, but a living testament to survival. He worked the land again, not out of duty, but out of gratitude. Every seed he planted was a promise that life, no matter how battered, would endure. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, he joined Clara by the rebuilt garden. The air smelled of earth and wildflowers. She was kneeling among the rows of beans, her hands dusty, her face lit with quiet contentment. He crouched beside her, placing a hand over hers. "Looks like the land's finally forgiving us." She smiled softly. Maybe it was never the land that needed forgiving. He chuckled, leaning in to kiss her temple. "You always did have the last word. And you always needed someone to keep you humble." They laughed, the sound rolling warm across the empty plains dot above them. The first stars began to appear bright and eternal. Elias took her hand and guided it to rest over his heart, steady and strong. "You remember the first time I told you to get inside?" he asked. She laughed, the memory bright in her mind. "How could I forget?" He turned toward her, his voice low and tender. "This time, I'm the one inside right where I belong." She smiled, tears glimmering in her eyes as the last light of day faded around them. "Then stay, Elias Thorne. Stay inside forever." He kissed her, slow and certain, the world falling away until there was only the soft whisper of the wind, the scent of sage and dust, and the steady beat of two hearts that had finally found home. The town of Solitude would tell their story for generations, of the widow who saved the rancher, of the man who built his life on redemption, and of the love that withstood storm, fire, and gunfire to become legend dot and somewhere out on the prairie, beneath a sky vast and eternal. The whisper of that love carried on the wind. "Get inside, widow." "Already there?"